"Ma'am, put your hands where I can see them." The voice cut through the soft hum of the shopping mall like a blade, sharp enough to make conversations nearby falter mid-sentence. And for a moment, the air itself seemed to hesitate as Amara Williams stopped walking, her fingers still lightly curled around the leather strap of her bag, the polished tile beneath her heels reflecting the sterile white glow of overhead lights that buzzed faintly like distant static, and she turned slowly, not startled, not defensive, just precise, as if every movement had already been measured long before this moment arrived. Her eyes settling on the uniformed officer approaching with a hand hovering near his radio, posture rigid, trained, certain, while two more figures closed in from either side, their footsteps echoing in uneven rhythm across the wide corridor lined with storefront glass and seasonal displays. The scent of pretzels and brewed coffee lingering awkwardly in a space that no longer felt ordinary. And somewhere behind her, a shopping bag slipped from someone's hand with a soft crinkle, unnoticed by most, but loud enough to register in the silence tightening around her. "We've had a report," the officer continued, his tone controlled, practiced, carrying the weight of assumption more than evidence, and Amara tilted her head just slightly, not in confusion, but in acknowledgement, as if she had heard this tone before, in different rooms, under different lights, wearing different faces, her coat falling neatly along her frame. Simple, understated, the kind that didn't demand attention, which perhaps was exactly why it drew suspicion now. And as the officers positioned themselves closer, creating a quiet perimeter that nudged curious onlookers to slow their steps, to glance, to linger just long enough to feel involved without speaking, the faint glow of a phone screen lifted somewhere to her right, angled discreetly, capturing, recording, waiting, and Amara exhaled once, steady, controlled, the kind of breath that didn't seek relief but created space, her gaze moving from one officer to the next, not challenging, not yielding, just present, as the lead officer's hand extended slightly toward her bag, not touching, but claiming intention. "We're going to need you to set that down," he said, and the words landed heavier than they should have, carrying more than instruction, carrying implication, carrying judgment dressed as procedure. And for a fraction of a second, something shifted. In the reflection beneath her feet, the clean lines of the mall distorting just enough to remind her how quickly order could bend under perception. And still, she didn't move immediately, not out of defiance, but out of precision, as if even compliance required clarity, her fingers loosening slowly from the strap, letting the bag rest against her side rather than the floor, her posture straight, composed, grounded in a stillness that didn't match the rising tension around her. And in that silence, subtle but undeniable, the imbalance of power became visible, not in force, not in volume, but in assumption, in the quiet certainty of those who believe they already understood the situation, while she simply stood there, centered in the middle of it, her voice finally breaking the moment, calm, even, unmistakably deliberate. "Officer," she said, her tone low but clear enough to settle the air again. "Before we go any further, I'd like to understand what exactly you believe happened." The officer's jaw tightened just slightly, not enough for most people to notice, but enough for the tension to shift by a fraction, and he glanced briefly at his partner before answering, as if confirming an unspoken agreement already made before she ever turned around. "We received a call from one of the stores," he said, his voice steady but edged with something less certain than before. "They reported a missing item, and you matched the description leaving the area," and the words hung there, incomplete in a way that made them feel heavier than if he had been more specific, while behind him, the second officer adjusted his stance, crossing his arms loosely, eyes scanning her from head to toe with a practiced kind of assessment that did not ask questions so much as it looked for confirmation of what it already believed. And Amara listened without interrupting, her expression unchanged, her gaze unwavering, absorbing each detail as if filing it away with quiet precision, the kind of listening that did not rush to respond because it did not need to. And somewhere to her left, a child's voice whispered a question that was quickly hushed by a parent, the subtle ripple of curiosity spreading outward as more people slowed their steps, their reflections multiplying in the glass storefronts, turning the scene into something larger than it was, something witnessed, something recorded not just by phones, but by memory, and Amara shifted her weight slightly, not retreating, not advancing, just grounding herself more firmly in place, her hand resting lightly against the side of her bag, not protective, not defensive, simply present. A description, she repeated, her tone calm, thoughtful, as if testing the weight of the word rather than challenging it. Could you clarify what that description included? And the officer hesitated, just for a second, long enough for the silence to register, his eyes flicking toward the small crowd that had begun to gather at a careful distance, aware enough to feel the pressure of being watched, but not enough to step back. And when he spoke again, his words came more measured, more deliberate. Female, mid-30s, dark coat, carrying a brown bag. And the simplicity of it landed with a quiet finality that seemed to justify everything that had followed. While Amara's gaze softened almost imperceptibly, not in agreement, but in recognition, as if she had heard this reasoning before, seen it unfold in different rooms under oath, in transcripts, in testimonies that began exactly like this. Ordinary details stacked together until they felt like certainty, and she nodded once, slowly, acknowledging the explanation without accepting it, her voice steady as she responded. And based on that, you determined I should be stopped here. And the question was not sharp, not confrontational, but it carried a clarity that shifted the balance of the conversation, turning it from accusation into examination. And for the first time, the officer's posture adjusted, subtle but real, his shoulders easing back a fraction as if recalibrating, aware now that the exchange was not unfolding the way he expected. While the third officer shifted his radio slightly, the faint crackle of static breaking the quiet for a moment before fading again. And Amara's eyes moved briefly across each of them, taking in the details, the badges, the placement of their hands, the distance between them, the way the crowd hovered just beyond an invisible line. And then she looked back at the lead officer, her voice still calm, still even, but now carrying a quiet firmness that did not need volume to be heard. I am willing to cooperate, she said, each word deliberate, measured. But I would like to understand the basis for your suspicion before we proceed further. And in that moment, the space between them shifted. Again, not dramatically, not visibly to everyone, but enough that the certainty that had filled it at the beginning no longer felt as solid, replaced instead by something more fragile, something that required explanation rather than assumption, and the hum of the lights above seemed louder now, the reflections sharper, the silence more defined, as if the scene itself was waiting to see what would happen next. The lead officer inhaled slowly, the kind of breath that signaled a shift from routine to something more deliberate, and his hand moved from hovering near his radio to resting firmly at his side, as if grounding himself in the procedure he had been trained to trust. "Ma'am, we are responding to a report," he said, choosing each word more carefully now, aware of the growing stillness around them. And part of that response includes verifying the situation. And while the sentence sounded complete, it lacked the confidence it carried just moments earlier, the certainty thinning under the weight of her calm. While behind him, one of the officers adjusted his footing again, his shoe making a faint squeak against the polished tile that echoed louder than it should have, drawing a few more eyes from the passing crowd that was no longer passing, just watching, lingering in that quiet space between curiosity and discomfort. And Amara's gaze did not waver, her expression composed, almost neutral. But there was something else there now, something sharper beneath the calm, not anger, not fear, but awareness, the kind that came from understanding exactly how moments like this unfolded, step by step, word by word, until they became something larger than any one person involved. And she gave a small nod, acknowledging his explanation without interrupting, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough to make space for the next move. And when she spoke again, her voice carried the same measured clarity, but now with a subtle edge of precision that redirected the entire exchange. "Verifying the situation requires specific facts," she said, her tone even, her posture unchanged, not just general similarities. And the words settled between them with quiet weight, not confrontational, but undeniable. And for a brief moment, the officer did not respond, his eyes narrowing slightly as he processed her statement, while the second officer glanced toward the storefront behind Amara, as if expecting confirmation to appear in the reflection. Something tangible that would anchor their suspicion in more than a description. But there was nothing. Only the mirrored image of 3 uniforms and one still figure standing at the center of it all, and the faint glow of a phone screen lifted higher now, no longer discreet, capturing the angle where authority met composure, where assumption met clarity, and the lead officer cleared his throat softly, shifting his stance as he spoke again. The report came from store security, he added, as if the source alone should reinforce the validity of their actions. They indicated that an item had been taken and that you exited the store shortly after. And this time, the explanation carried more structure, more detail, but still lacked the one element that would make it complete, certainty rooted in evidence rather than proximity. And Amara listened, her head tilting just slightly, as if aligning each piece in place. Her fingers brushing lightly against the side of her coat, not fidgeting, not restless, just present. And when she responded, her voice remained calm, but now it held something unmistakably firm, something that did not rise in volume but in authority. "Did anyone from that store identify me directly?" she asked, and the question landed cleanly, precisely, leaving no room for interpretation, and the officer hesitated again, longer this time, his gaze flicking briefly toward his partner before returning to her, the pause stretching just enough for the surrounding silence to deepen. And in that pause, something shifted again, not outwardly, not dramatically, but internally, as if the foundation of the situation had begun to move beneath the surface, subtle but undeniable. And the third officer reached for his radio instinctively, not pressing it, just holding it, as if unsure whether to call for confirmation or remain still, while Amara stood exactly where she had been from the beginning, centered, composed, her presence steady in a way that contrasted sharply with the growing uncertainty around her. And when the officer finally spoke, his voice was quieter, less certain than before. Not directly, he admitted, and the words, simple as they were, carried more impact than anything that had been said so far. Because for the first time, the assumption had been named for what it was, and the space between them no longer belonged entirely to authority, but to something else, something that required accountability. The words settled, heavier than the silence that followed, and for a moment no one moved. Not the officers, not the small cluster of onlookers, not even the flickering reflections in the glass storefronts that seemed to hold the scene in place like a paused frame. And the lead officer's expression shifted again, subtle but undeniable. The confidence that had guided his earlier steps now replaced with something more measured, more cautious, as if he were recalculating the ground beneath him one detail at a time. And he nodded once, slowly, acknowledging what had just been said without fully conceding it. "We are still going to need to check your bag," he replied, his tone controlled, but no longer carrying the same unquestioned authority. And the statement lingered there, not quite an order, not quite a request, suspended somewhere in between, while the second officer glanced briefly toward the growing crowd. The awareness of being observed now pressing in from all sides, the faint glow of multiple phone screens reflecting off polished surfaces, capturing angles, capturing expressions, capturing hesitation, and Amara remained still, her posture unchanged, her presence steady in a way that seemed to anchor the entire moment, her eyes resting on the lead officer with quiet focus, not challenging, not retreating, just present in a way that demanded clarity without raising her voice. And when she spoke again, her tone remained calm, but the precision in her words sharpened, narrowing the space for ambiguity. "You are asking to search my personal property," she said, each word deliberate, measured, without direct identification, without recovered evidence, and without establishing clear probable cause. And the phrase settled between them like a line drawn in plain view, not dramatic, not loud, but unmistakable. And the officer's jaw tightened again, his eyes flicking briefly toward his partner before returning to her, the pause stretching just long enough to reveal uncertainty, where there had once been certainty. And somewhere behind them, a voice murmured, low but audible, "She sounds like a lawyer," followed by a quiet response that did not fully form, dissolving into the hum of the space. And the third officer shifted his radio again, his thumb brushing against the button but not pressing it, as if caught between action and hesitation, while Amara's gaze remained steady, her hands relaxed at her sides, not defensive, not tense, simply grounded in the weight of the moment, continued to build not through movement, but through stillness, through the absence of escalation, through the quiet unraveling of assumption under scrutiny. And the lead officer exhaled slowly, his shoulders easing just slightly as he adjusted his stance. The authority he carried now tempered by the awareness that the situation was no longer unfolding in a straight line. And when he spoke again, his voice was more careful, more deliberate. "Ma'am, if you have nothing to hide, this will be quick." And the sentence landed with a familiar cadence, one that had likely worked in countless situations before. But here, now, it did not settle the way it was intended to. It did not close the gap. It did not restore control, because the space between them had already changed, and Amara's expression softened just slightly, not in agreement, but in recognition, as if she had heard this reasoning many times before. In courtrooms, in testimonies, in moments where assumption tried to disguise itself as procedure. And she took a slow, steady breath, her voice remaining calm, but now carrying a quiet firmness that did not need volume to be felt. "That is not how rights work," she said, the words simple, clear, and unyielding. And for a moment, the entire space seemed to pause again. The hum of the lights, the distant sound of footsteps, the quiet murmurs of the crowd, all folding into a stillness that made the shift unmistakable, because this was no longer just a stop, no longer just a question. It had become something else entirely, something that required more than authority to resolve, something that demanded understanding. And as the officer stood there, facing her, the certainty that had brought him into this moment no longer felt complete, replaced instead by something far less comfortable, something that did not offer easy answers, only the weight of what came next. The statement did not echo, but it lingered, settling into the polished floor and the glass walls and the stillness between every person standing there. And for a moment no one spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because what had just been said could not be easily dismissed. And the lead officer's posture shifted again, his shoulders no longer squared with the same certainty, his weight subtly redistributing as if the ground beneath him had become less stable, and his eyes moved briefly past Amara, scanning the edges of the crowd that had grown just enough to feel present, just enough to matter, faces half lit by the glow of screens, some curious, some cautious, all waiting. And when he looked back at her, there was a hesitation now that had not existed before, a pause that stretched just long enough to reveal that the situation had moved beyond routine. "Ma'am," he began again, his voice lower, more measured. "We are trying to resolve this quickly." And the words sounded less like instruction and more like negotiation, as if the outcome was no longer guaranteed, while the second officer shifted closer, not aggressively, but with a subtle urgency, his voice quieter as he leaned slightly toward his partner. "We should just confirm with the store," he murmured, not fully turning his head, the suggestion slipping into the space between them like a lifeline. And the lead officer did not respond immediately, his gaze still fixed on Amara, as if weighing the options in real time. The authority he carried now intersecting with the uncertainty he could no longer ignore. And Amara remained exactly where she had been, her stance unchanged, her presence steady in a way that did not escalate, but did not yield, her eyes calm, observant, aware of every shift, every glance, every subtle recalibration happening in front of her. And she did not interrupt, did not press further, allowing the silence to expand just enough for the moment to speak for itself. And somewhere behind her, a quiet voice whispered, "This is not right," followed by the soft rustle of movement as someone adjusted their position, the collective awareness of the crowd deepening, no longer passive, no longer distant, but engaged in a way that could not be undone. And the third officer finally lifted his radio, pressing the button with a soft click that cut through the stillness. "Dispatch, can we get confirmation from mall security on the reported incident?" he said, his tone professional, controlled, but carrying an undercurrent of urgency that had not been there before. And the faint crackle of static responded, filling the space with a sound that felt louder than it should have, stretching the moment even further as everyone waited. And Amara's gaze shifted briefly toward the radio, then back to the officer in front of her, her expression unchanged, her composure unwavering. And for the first time since the encounter began, The momentum had shifted away from assumption and toward verification, away from certainty and toward question, and the lead officer exhaled slowly, his jaw unclenching just slightly, as if releasing a tension he had not realized he was holding, and his voice, when he spoke again, carried a different weight now, less force, more restraint. "We are going to wait for confirmation," he said, not as an order, but as a decision, one that acknowledged the shift without fully admitting it, and the space between them settled into a new kind of stillness, one that was no longer driven by authority alone, but by the quiet understanding that something had changed, something that could not be reversed simply by continuing forward. And as the seconds passed, stretching longer than they should have, the hum of the lights above seemed sharper, the reflections clearer, the presence of every person in that corridor more defined, and Amara stood at the center of it all, not moving, not speaking, her calm no longer just a response, but a force in itself, steady, unshaken, and quietly reshaping everything around her. The radio crackled again, softer this time, like a distant storm that had not yet decided whether to arrive or pass, and the officer holding it kept his thumb near the button, not pressing, just waiting, his eyes flicking briefly toward the lead officer as if searching for reassurance that the pause they had entered was the right one, while the corridor seemed to narrow around them, not physically, but in focus, every detail sharpening under the weight of attention, the hum of the fluorescent lights above no longer background noise but a steady presence that filled the silence between breaths, and Amara stood unmoving, her shoulders relaxed, her gaze steady, the faint reflection of her silhouette stretching across the polished floor like a quiet line that refused to break. And for the first time, the moment was no longer about what had been said, but about what had not yet been confirmed. And that absence carried its own kind of pressure, subtle but undeniable, pressing into the space where certainty used to stand. And the lead officer shifted his stance again, his hand brushing briefly against his belt before falling back to his side, a small movement that revealed more than he intended, a sign that the situation had moved beyond routine, beyond the familiar rhythm of command and compliance. And his eyes moved across Amara's face, searching not for guilt now, but for something else, something that would explain the calm she carried so effortlessly, the kind of composure that did not match the circumstances as he understood them. And in that search, something in his expression softened, not in apology, not yet, but in recognition that the moment required more than assumption, and somewhere behind them, a pair of footsteps slowed, then stopped completely, the faint sound of a shopping bag brushing against fabric marking the edge of the growing audience, while a voice whispered quietly, almost to itself, "She has not even raised her voice." And the observation lingered, small but significant, adding to the quiet shift that had been building since the beginning, and Amara inhaled slowly, the movement barely visible, her chest rising just enough to catch the light before settling again. And in that breath there was no urgency, no fear, only control, the kind that came from understanding not just the situation, but the structure beneath it, the rules that governed it even when others chose not to see them. And her eyes moved briefly toward the officer with the radio, then back to the lead officer, her gaze steady, present, patient in a way that did not rush the outcome but shaped it. And the seconds stretched longer than they should have, each one marked by the absence of confirmation, the absence of proof, the absence of anything that could justify what had already been set in motion. And the lead officer exhaled again, slower this time, his shoulders easing further as if releasing a tension he could no longer sustain. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter, less certain, but more grounded in the moment than before. "We are waiting on security," he said, not as a command, not even as a reassurance, but as a statement of fact. And the words settled into the space between them without resistance, because they no longer needed to assert control, they only needed to hold the moment together until the truth arrived. And Amara gave a slight nod, acknowledging the statement without adding to it, her silence no longer passive, but intentional, a presence that filled the space just as much as any words could have. And around them, the corridor remained still, suspended between what had been assumed and what had yet to be confirmed, every person present aware, in some quiet way, that whatever came next would not simply continue the moment, but redefine it entirely. The radio came alive again, this time sharper, the static clearing just enough for a voice to push through, controlled but urgent. Unit 3, be advised, mall security reports no confirmed theft at this time. And the words landed with a quiet finality that seemed to pull the air out of the space all at once, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that shifted everything without needing to raise its volume. And the officer holding the radio froze for a fraction of a second, his thumb still resting near the button, as if the message had not fully settled yet, while the lead officer's expression changed in a way that could not be hidden now, the last traces of certainty slipping away as the foundation of the situation collapsed beneath him, and his gaze dropped briefly, just for a moment, before returning to Amara. But it was no longer the same look, no longer searching for confirmation of suspicion, but grappling with the absence of it, and the silence that followed was deeper than before, not tense, not expectant, but heavy with realization, as if every person in that corridor understood at the same time that the moment had turned, that something irreversible had just occurred, and Amara did not move, did not speak, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, the calm she had carried from the beginning now filling the space in a way that felt undeniable. And somewhere in the crowd, a quiet voice murmured, "There was nothing," followed by another, softer still. They stopped her for nothing, and the words spread in low ripples, not loud enough to disrupt, but enough to be felt, enough to shift the weight of attention entirely, and the second officer exhaled under his breath, his shoulders dropping slightly as he glanced away, no longer holding the same position, while the third officer lowered his radio slowly, the device that had carried authority now delivering something else entirely, something that could not support what had already been done. And the lead officer cleared his throat, the sound small but sharp in the quiet, his hand brushing briefly against his uniform as if searching for composure, for something to steady himself. But there was nothing left to anchor to, no report, no confirmation, no evidence. Only the reality of the moment standing plainly in front of him. And when he spoke, his voice was different now, stripped of the earlier firmness, measured but no longer certain. "Ma'am," he began, pausing briefly as if choosing his words with more care than before. "It appears there may have been a misunderstanding," and the sentence hung in the air, incomplete in its attempt to contain what had just unfolded, while Amara's eyes remained on him, steady, composed, her expression unchanged. But there was something in her gaze now that reflected more than calm, something that carried the weight of recognition, not surprise, not satisfaction, but understanding, the kind that did not need explanation, and she gave a small nod, not in acceptance, but in acknowledgement of what had been said, and the silence that followed was no longer empty, but full, filled with the quiet awareness that the moment had revealed more than anyone intended. And the lead officer shifted again, his posture no longer rigid, his stance no longer fixed, as if the role he had stepped into at the beginning no longer fit the reality in front of him. And the corridor, once just a passage between stores, now held something else entirely, something that lingered even as nothing moved, a stillness that carried the unmistakable weight of truth finally spoken. The words lingered, fragile and insufficient, and for a moment the officer seemed to understand that no simple phrase could contain what had just unfolded, his posture shifting again as if the weight of the moment had finally settled fully onto him, and his gaze dropped briefly before returning to Amara, no longer searching, no longer asserting, but acknowledging. And when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, stripped of the certainty it once carried. "Ma'am, I apologize for the inconvenience," he said, the sentence measured, careful, but incomplete in a way that left space for everything it did not address. And the silence that followed did not reject his words, but it did not soften them either. It simply held them there, suspended, while the second officer looked away entirely now, his attention fixed somewhere beyond the scene, as if distancing himself from it could lessen its impact. And the third officer adjusted his grip on the radio before lowering it completely to his side, the device now silent, its earlier authority replaced by the stillness that surrounded them. And Amara stood exactly where she had been from the beginning, her presence unchanged, her expression calm. But there was something in her stillness that had deepened, something that carried not just composure, but clarity, the kind that did not need to raise its voice to be heard, and she regarded the officer for a moment, not with anger, not with triumph, but with a steady awareness that seemed to hold the entire exchange in perspective. And when she finally spoke, her voice remained even, controlled, but now carried a quiet weight that filled the space between them. An inconvenience implies something minor, she said, each word deliberate, unhurried. This was a decision, and the distinction settled into the air with a clarity that no one could ignore, and the officer's jaw tightened. Again, not in resistance, but in recognition, his shoulders easing slightly as if accepting the truth in her words, while behind them, the crowd remained still, no longer whispering, no longer shifting, but watching with a different kind of attention now, one that understood what had been revealed without needing it explained. And Amara continued, her tone never rising, never sharp, but unwavering in its precision. You acted without confirmation, based on a description that could apply to anyone standing here. And she gestured lightly, not dramatically, just enough to acknowledge the space around them. The people who had witnessed everything, the reflections that had captured it from every angle. And then her hand returned to her side, her posture unchanged, grounded, present. That matters, she added, the words simple, but carrying more weight than anything spoken before, and the officer nodded slowly. The movement small but genuine, his gaze no longer avoiding hers, but meeting it directly, not as authority, but as acknowledgement. And for a moment, the space between them shifted again, not back to what it had been, but forward into something else, something quieter, something more honest, and the corridor, once filled with tension, now held a different kind of stillness, one that did not erase what had happened, but allowed it to exist fully, without distraction, without denial. And Amara remained there for one more breath, her presence steady, her composure intact, before her gaze softened just slightly, not in forgiveness, not in dismissal, but in completion, as if the moment had reached its natural end. And without another word, she reached for the strap of her bag, lifting it lightly back into place, the simple motion carrying a quiet finality. And as she turned to leave, her steps were unhurried, measured, the sound of her heels against the polished floor steady and clear, not rushed, not hesitant, just moving forward, while behind her, the officers remained where they stood, the space they occupied no longer defined by authority, but by the silence that followed it, a silence that said everything that words no longer could. Her footsteps carried forward with a steady rhythm, each step measured, deliberate, echoing softly against the polished tile as the distance between her and the officers grew not just in space, but in meaning, and the corridor slowly began to breathe again, the tension that had once filled it loosening in quiet increments, though not disappearing entirely, because something had been left behind, something that would not fade as quickly as the sound of her heels. And as she passed the glass storefronts, her reflection moved alongside her, composed, upright, unchanged, a quiet reminder that nothing about her had shifted, only the perception around her had been forced to adjust. And behind her, the officers remained still for a moment longer, as if unsure whether to move or remain rooted in the space where the encounter had unfolded, their presence now subdued, no longer commanding the same attention, no longer defining the moment. And one by one, the subtle sounds of them all returned, the distant hum of conversation, the faint clatter of dishes from a nearby cafe, the soft shuffle of footsteps resuming their paths. But even as normalcy began to reassemble itself, there was a lingering awareness that something had changed, something that could not be undone simply by continuing forward. And a few people lowered their phones slowly, not out of disinterest, but out of recognition that what they had witnessed was complete, that the moment did not require more recording, only reflection. And as Amara approached the end of the corridor, she paused briefly near a column where the light shifted, warmer now, softer, catching the edge of her profile and illuminating the quiet strength in her expression. And for a second, she adjusted the strap of her bag, a small, ordinary gesture that carried no weight on its own, but in the context of everything that had just occurred, felt like a quiet reclaiming of space, of movement, of self. And then she continued, her pace unchanged, her posture steady, her presence no longer questioned, no longer interrupted, simply allowed to exist as it always had, and behind her. The lead officer finally moved, a single step back, subtle but telling, his gaze following her. For a moment before lowering, not in avoidance, but in thought, as if replaying the sequence of decisions that had led to this point, and the silence around him was no longer empty, but reflective, filled with the quiet weight of understanding. And as the crowd dispersed, their conversations returning in hushed tones, there was a shared awareness that lingered, unspoken but present, that what had happened was not just a moment, but a pattern revealed, a line drawn into visibility, and the corridor, once ordinary, now held that imprint, invisible but undeniable. And as Amara reached the exit, the glass doors sliding open with a soft mechanical sigh, the outside lights spilled in, brighter, clearer, washing over the polished floor and stretching into the space behind her, and she stepped through without hesitation, her figure moving into the daylight with the same calm certainty she had carried from the beginning. And as the doors closed behind her, sealing the moment inside, the reflection of the interior lingered for just a second longer on the glass before fading, leaving only the quiet aftermath, the stillness of a space that had witnessed something it could not forget. And in that silence, there was no announcement, no resolution spoken aloud, only the unmistakable presence of something deeper, something that settled not in words, but in the quiet understanding that remained long after she was gone.